Some movies derail careers because of how bad they are or how badly they flop, but other movies derail how these studios conduct business. One movie can end a whole genre for years, if not decades, or even a way of making movies. After all, there's a reason that Disney doesn't do 2D animation anymore. In this video, I want to take a look at the movies that broke how Hollywood did things. These movies ended entire eras and changed how business was conducted. Interestingly, not all of them are bad. Some of them are great and others are extremely fun. Alas, people skipped them at the theaters and so a reckoning was due. In the late 1960s, something was happening in Hollywood, and indeed in America. The golden age of Hollywood, already weakened by the rise of television and anti-monopoly laws, was coming to a close. The studio system was in decline, and the mood of the country was shifting away from the saccharine traditional fare that had once reigned supreme. A new, more cynical generation wanted smart, gritty movies that spoke to their reality. They made their preference clear at the box office. 1967 is the year that everything changed. Films like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, In the Heat of the Night, Cool Hand Luke, and The Dirty Dozen marked a new wave of movie making, while the once popular musical was on the decline. That shift was epitomized by the catastrophic failure of Dr. Dolittle in 1967. Adapted from Hugh Lofting's novel series, Dr. Dolittle was a musical starring Rex Harrison as a veterinarian who can talk to animals. It was a lavish $17 million production, nearly double what Jaws would cost in 1975, and $7 million more than Star Wars in 1977. The movie was a logistical nightmare involving multiple rewrites, costly reshoots, and 1,200 live animals. It's no wonder, then, that the original $6 million budget damn near tripled. Fox knew early on that they had a dud on their hands, as test screenings went pretty poorly. Bosley Crowther, a critic for the New York Times, would say, quote, "The music is not exceptional, the rendering of the songs lacks variety, and the pace under Richard Fleischer's direction is slow and without surprise," end quote. Released just a couple of months after Disney's The Jungle Book, another charming movie about someone who can talk to animals, Dr. Dolittle got mollywopped. It made just $9 million, whereas The Jungle Book would, over the course of its life, make $378 million at the box office. Gone were the glory days of the musical. New theatergoers thought of these as quaint relics of a bygone era. Musicals were status quo, saccharine, and unserious. Audiences wanted counterculture and revolution on the big screen. The cold critical reception and decimation of the box office meant that the movie was like the Hindenburg. Hollywood would reduce its musical output, and the musical would change over the years, focusing more on pop music. The focus, instead, shifted to movies like Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider, movies that could be made cheaply but have an outsized impact on the box office. Dr. Dolittle is, more than anything, emblematic of the end of the golden age of Hollywood. It had an excellent run over several decades, but like all golden ages, it had to come to an end and paved the way for a new age. William Friedkin's 1977 movie, Sorcerer, is a phenomenal work, arguably one of the best movies of the 1970s. An adaptation of the French classic, The Wages of Fear, it's about four desperate men transporting unstable explosives throughout the jungle. Much like Dr. Dolittle a decade earlier, Sorcerer arrived during a transitional year for Hollywood. The new Hollywood era, led by directors like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, and William Friedkin, had taken root and toppled the old guard. These were the guys that had their fingers on the pulse of society, which they showed off with hits like The Exorcist, Jaws, The Godfather, and Star Wars. What they didn't know, however, was that their time was coming to an end, and Sorcerer is emblematic of all the problems that would soon be turned to 11 with Heaven's Gate a few years later, though we'll get to that in a bit. By this time, the new Hollywood had somewhat factionalized. On one hand, you had Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, who preferred doing commercial films. They wanted to make the kind of movies that would make them happy and that would thrill others. Jaws and Star Wars, released within a few years of each other, are the two movies that ushered in the blockbuster era and were living in the world that they created. Then you had guys like William Friedkin. Riding high on the success of The Exorcist and The French Connection, Friedkin got a $2.5 million budget for Sorcerer. The final budget would end up being $22 million. The guy went almost 9 times over the original budget, which is, to accountants, horrifying. Even Michael Cimino wasn't that bad. The reason was simple. Friedkin wanted to film the movie in the actual jungle, which meant dealing with the lack of infrastructure, which needed to be built from scratch, as well as disease. Friedkin, who lost 50 pounds and contracted malaria, said, quote, "Almost half the crew went into the hospital or had to be sent home," end quote. Moreover, though, Friedkin was difficult to work with. He fired multiple production managers and clashed with the stars. He was willing to put his crew in harm's way to get the right shot, such as when he kept shooting when a real explosion was going off. It was the price some paid for working with an auteur. They weren't often the nicest people. Now, studios were willing to put up with that if they made money. Sorcerer did not. It made $9 million worldwide and got mixed reviews. It would only be reappraised in later years. It was also released at a terrible, terrible time. Coming out just a month after Star Wars, the movie got lost in the former's immense shadow. No one wanted to see Sorcerer when they could see Star Wars, which was a real phenomenon. Lucas's masterwork was a feel-good story of good versus evil. Friedkin's Sorcerer is intense and pessimistic. The country was no longer in the self-reflective mood that it had been a decade prior. After Watergate, after the Vietnam War, people wanted some joy, and this movie was joyless. It led to studios becoming much more skeptical of working with auteur movie directors that couldn't get audiences to shell out. Audiences wanted escapist cinema like Star Wars now, and sci-fi was going to experience a massive boom in the 1980s. Some of it would be touching, like E.T., others would be intelligent and foreboding, like Blade Runner. But one thing was certain. The studio, which had lost some of its power in the 1960s, was about to reassert its dominance, making examples out of people like William Friedkin, who wouldn't get a big budget until nearly 2 decades later. Today, Sorcerer is much beloved, and rightly so. It has some of the best explosions in any movie ever, and is a genuinely thrilling experience. But it also set in motion the end of movies similar to it. Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, released in 1980, is the movie credited with bringing an end both to the New Hollywood and United Artists, though the latter is overblown. And, to be fair, Cimino had a lot of help from directors like Friedkin, Francis Ford Coppola, and Martin Scorsese, the latter two who released a pair of musicals that flopped. Heaven's Gate also put a damper on the Western film, though it was already on something of a decline. Cimino, hot off of his Academy Award win for The Deer Hunter, was given a blank check to make the movie of his dreams. He took that literally, making a movie whose budget ballooned from $12 million to $44 million. It's one of the most notorious cases of going over budget in Hollywood, made all the more notable because it made just $3.5 million at the box office, an absolute catastrophe. The film had a sprawling cast and production, and Cimino's perfectionism made everything harder than it had to be. They called him the Ayatollah, and the production was plagued with dozens of takes of scenes and a director who, seemingly, was never happy. For example, Cimino had a set built, then torn down because he wanted to move it a few feet. There were also reports that he delayed production until a particular cloud was in view. The only reason the movie got made was Cimino's reputation. Sci-fi and action-adventure movies had eclipsed the Western as a genre, and their glory days were gone. And after the movie collapsed at the box office and was universally rebuked by critics, so were Cimino's. Vincent Canby, in an amusing review for the New York Times, wrote that, quote, "It fails so completely that you might suspect Mr. Cimino sold his soul to the devil to obtain the success of The Deer Hunter, and the devil has just come around to collect," end quote. To be sure, the film has been reappraised positively since. It was beloved in Europe, and some knocked older critics for piling onto the film and trying to outdo each other in how much they hated it, something many still do today. In 2012, a 216-minute director's cut received critical acclaim. That was cold comfort for Cimino, who would only make a few more movies before grinding to a halt, his legacy in tatters. After Heaven's Gate spooked studios, they began to reassert their dominance. The 80s would be a producer and studio-driven era of high-concept films that lacked what many would call the intelligence of the 70s movies. I'm not sure that I personally agree with that sentiment. The 80s had plenty of smart movies and a lot more fun movies. But this would mean that the role of the director as the creative force of a movie would subside during that decade. You still had some directors that did whatever they wanted, like Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, and James Cameron, but the visionary auteur was becoming a thing of the past. Budgetary control, strict schedules, and a growing reliance on franchises became the norm. The 80s became the blockbuster era, and, to an extent, it's still the era that we're living in right now, though indie films do seem to be making a resounding return. But long gone are the days when the director and studio had a melding of the minds like they did in the 70s. And, alas, while Heaven's Gate wasn't the be-all end-all collapse of the New Hollywood, it and Michael Cimino did become its scapegoats. 1987's Masters of the Universe, directed by Gary Goddard, was one in a series of 80s movies that were made on toys. Studios were examining all the IP they could get their hands on after the success of shows like Transformers and G.I. Joe. It led to 1985's Clue and 1986's The Garbage Pail Kids movies, both of which were flops. But figuring that they were different, Canon Films, already in dire financial straits and not far off bankruptcy, decided that they would take a risk on Mattel's extremely popular He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. It had already been turned into a successful show, and maybe they could find success on the big screen that could also save the company. After all, if muscle-bound heroes like Conan the Barbarian and Rambo could make big bucks on the big screen, why not Dolph Lundgren as He-Man? Canon figured that $22 million and a built-in fanbase would deliver them a surefire hit. The only thing they forgot to make was a good movie. The movie crashed and burned, making just $17 million at the box office and failing to impress critics and audiences. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus captures it well. Quote, "Masters of the Universe is a slapdash adaptation of the He-Man mythos that can overcome its cynical lack of raison d'etre no matter how admirably Frank Langella throws himself into the role of Skeletor." End quote. Basically, a movie that had no reason to exist. Langella called Skeletor one of his favorite roles, while Dolph Lundgren called He-Man one of his least favorite. It did a number on his career as well. After a couple of more theatrical releases, Lundgren was relegated to doing direct-to-video movies, which is a shame as he is a decent enough actor. But the movie did more of a number on toy movies. It crushed the market for them. For almost 2 decades, studios would shy away from doing movies based on toys. They had no one to blame but themselves, of course. They thought that they could just tap into the IP and fill seats. They didn't care about the production values of the films. It was meant to be a cash grab, instead it was a cash sink. It wouldn't be until Michael Bay arrived on the scene with 2007's Transformers that the toy movie roared back to life in a big bad way. Bay single-handedly turned toy films into a billion-dollar industry that he controlled, only stepping away after making 5 Transformers movies. Advancements in CGI, as well as a filmmaker with a strong visual style, were necessary for this, and there was no one better than Bay to do it. Experiments like the Lego Movie in 2014 led to further success, showing different kinds of toy movies could also succeed. 2023's Barbie, of course, was a phenomenon unto itself. All of these movies, though, do owe something to He-Man. Though it was never popular in its own time, it has, rightfully, become a cult hit and seen a resurgence in popularity. Something people might not know about me is that I love pirate movies. I love pirate shows. I love pirate video games. I even love pirate books. Suffice it to say that swashbuckling stories speak to me on a deep level, or at the very least, they are fun as hell. 1995's Cutthroat Island, directed by Rennie Harlin and starring Gina Davis and Matthew Modine, was such an adventure, and it is a fun movie. Produced by Carolco Pictures, the film wanted to revive the pirate genre, which actually used to be pretty popular in Hollywood. In fact, during the 50s and 60s, you had some years where the studios would release as many as 10 pirate movies in a single year. What Cutthroat Island actually did was sink the genre until the new millennium, when Disney actually revived it with Pirates of the Caribbean, some of the funnest movies ever made. No, Cutthroat Island, instead, was a failure of epic proportions, enough to ruin a man's career and sink a whole studio in the process. There's a good reason pirate movies don't get made. They were risky and expensive, and audiences didn't always show up. Carolco, which was on the brink of bankruptcy, needed a big win. Instead of doing a safe action movie, they instead bet the farm on reviving a genre. Cutthroat Island has the dishonor of being one of the biggest flops in film history. The movie's budget had swelled to $115 million, and it made just $16 million at the box office, an indisputable catastrophe. The inflated budget was a result of a troubled production. Carolco spent $2 million to get the script rights, then hired Rennie Harlin to do the movie for $60 million. That was a pipe dream. The film kept running into issues. They couldn't find a good lead actor, the script was being written without Harlin's input, and once filming did start, it kept getting delayed due to issues like injuries. Harlin even tore down existing sets and had them rebuilt because they were finished without his input. It was a big, audacious movie and suffered for it. But Cutthroat Island wasn't alone in doing grievous injury to my favorite genre. No, it had help. Its failure came the same year as another waterborne failure, Waterworld, first directed by Kevin Reynolds, though eventually taken over by Kevin Costner. The post-apocalyptic film, which is basically Mad Max on the high seas, was set on an Earth that was covered in ocean, and it was a hell of a production. It's one of the best documented box office disasters of all time, though it would be saved by home video sales. Even Steven Spielberg told them not to do it because filming in the open ocean is a huge pain. Reynolds had giant sets built on the water, which was a logistical nightmare. According to Reynolds, quote, "We had to transport these people from dry land out to the location, and so you're getting hundreds of people through wardrobe and everything, and you're putting them on boats, transporting them out to the atoll, and trying to get everybody in position to do a shot. And then, when you break for lunch, you have to put everybody on boats and take them back in to feed them," end quote. The 96-day shoot became a 150-day long shoot. The $100 million budget ballooned to $175 million. Mother Nature even hated them. One of the sets sank during a storm and had to be rebuilt. Costner, while filming a scene where he's tied to a mast, got caught in a storm and nearly drowned, as did other actors and crew members. To top it all off, the media circus around the movie, which had been nicknamed Kevin's Gate, was wild. But perhaps the lasting impact of the failure of Waterworld is that it made Hollywood more amenable to the CGI that would soon come to dominate. The practical sets for both Waterworld and Cutthroat Island were unwieldy and brought their own issues. As we entered the new millennium, Hollywood would increase its reliance on CGI as a means to creating worlds, as opposed to creating them from scratch and the old-fashioned way. With this transition, we lost some of that charm that you do see in older movies. 2011's Winnie the Pooh marked the end of an era. It was the last 2D animated movie that came out of Disney as they transitioned to focusing on 3D films. 2D animation had been on precarious footing within the industry for a while. 2009's The Princess and the Frog was a critical and commercial hit, but it didn't bring in the kind of money that a Pixar film brought in. 3D wasn't just on the rise, it had thoroughly dominated 2D. Critically, Winnie the Pooh was a much beloved movie and received near universal praise for its charm, humor, and faithful portrayal of the characters. Commercially though, it didn't manage to double its $30 million budget, though maybe releasing the same day as Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 was also a dumb idea. But the result did go a long way in confirming for Hollywood that, outside a few loyalists, no one really cared for 2D animation anymore, at least not on the big screen. They would pay for Pixar, for DreamWorks, even for Walt Disney Animation Studios' 3D fare, but that was it. Alas, the movie marked the end of an era, and while The Day the Earth Blew Up got great reviews, its box office probably only reinforced the notion for studios that these kinds of movies just don't fill seats. That, I think, is a shame. No two people are more responsible for some of the worst movies ever made than Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer. They also pretty much ruined the parody movie genre by themselves. They started as writers on Spy Hard and Scary Movie, before making movies like 2006's Date Movie, 2007's Epic Movie, 2008's Meet the Spartans and Disaster Movie, and 2010's Vampires Suck. Many of these movies were financially successful, but all of them were critically reviled. But things really got bad with 2013's The Starving Games. From the name, you can probably tell that it was supposed to be a parody of the Hunger Games franchise, though it would also parody other popular films like Avatar and The Avengers. The issue, unfortunately, is that the movies weren't funny. At least they weren't haha funny. You might scoff here and there, but they wouldn't sustain laughter. The movies failed even as parodies, mostly relying on excessive pop culture references and surface-level humor. A parody should provide insight into a genre and, to an extent, deconstruct it. In order to really be able to parody something successfully, like Mel Brooks did the Western in Blazing Saddles, you need to be deeply familiar with the genre, its stereotypes, and its structure. Brooks has a really good quote about this. In his words, quote, "I think you must have affection for whatever you tease. I love westerns, I love monster movies," end quote. You don't get the sense that Friedberg or Seltzer have much love for the movies that they lampoon. The movies were quickly and shoddily put together to capitalize on the pop culture trend of the day and were more mimics than parody. Actual parody is difficult to do well, and it's part of the reason we don't really get much of them anymore. You need to dissect the material carefully and thoughtfully, not in a slipshod way like Friedberg and Seltzer did. Joel Rosenblatt, writing for the Austin Chronicle, put it well, quote, "There's no nice way to say this, so I'll just say it. Writer-directors Friedberg and Seltzer are a scourge," end quote. I sort of agree. That being said, they did destroy an entire genre by themselves, which, viewed through a distorted lens, is kind of impressive. Though I've talked about them before, it is worth quickly mentioning 4 more Disney movies that led to a significant change at the House of Mouse. The failure of 2011's Mars Needs Moms, 2012's John Carter, 2013's The Lone Ranger, and 2015's Tomorrowland represents an outlay of nearly $1 billion by Disney, and all of them flopped critically and commercially. And these weren't small failures either. Each suffered more than $200 million in losses when marketing and production costs are factored in. Now, I like John Carter and The Lone Ranger, and even have a soft spot for Tomorrowland's sense of wonder and optimism. But these movies are also what changed how business was done at Disney and in Hollywood overall. The reliance on intellectual property, especially Marvel, Lucasfilm, and their live-action adaptations, can be traced to these 4 flops. They were attempts at either new original films or at revitalizing old icons like John Carter of Mars or The Lone Ranger, but they all failed spectacularly, leaving a black mark and a huge financial pit. It's like the movies traumatized the company, so they stopped funding giant adventure films altogether. That, I think, is a shame. It also had an effect on the rest of Hollywood, which is reliant on making movies people are already familiar with. it's led to a dearth of original movies outside of indie filmmakers. Disney is one of the few companies with enough money to take risks like these, and I think it's the kind of movie that they should lean into, not shy away from. Sure, they were flops, but they were interesting and as close to original as we can seemingly hope for. 2024 was a successful year for the company, and while 2025 has been off to a rough start, the rest of their slate looks like it'll be financially successful. I think it's well past time for the House of Mouse to take a big swing again. Failure has something of a reverberant effect. It can impact not only the people in the immediate vicinity, but an area at large. All of these are movies that forced change to how Hollywood conducted business, often in the form of scaring companies off from particular kinds of films. But, interestingly, many of these movies seem to be making something of a comeback. Wonka was an old-school kind of musical with a rising star in the form of Timothée Chalamet, and was a success. Toy movies are getting greenlit left and right, and the Pirates of the Caribbean movies are a billion-dollar franchise. While parody and 2D animated movies are still on the outs, I still won't count them out permanently. When it comes to the movies, anything can happen.